Peace be with you. I'm Pastor Stephen Gjerde at Zion and Bethany Lutheran Churches, and this is your word at the middle of the week for Wednesday, July 13th. We are in the book of Exodus, and so far, with Pastor Johnson over the last couple weeks, you got through Exodus 18, Exodus 19, and we are now at Exodus 20, which is the chapter in which Jesus, or God, of course Jesus is there, before his incarnation, almost 2,000 years later. But anyway, when God gives the word of the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai, you'll recall that the children of Israel are walking. When we say the children of Israel, we mean all the people of Israel. They're walking through the desert on their way to the promised land, the land of Israel, and they're being led there by Moses. They've been freed from slavery in Egypt. God is leading them by a pillar of cloud and fire, pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. And now he is going to be meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and he's going to give him what we call the covenant. The covenant is the words, the commands, also the promises that God gave to the people of Israel as the means by which he and they would remain bonded together throughout their life in the promised land. This covenant would become so important to the people of Israel that it became the focus, as it was meant to be, of their religious life, and not just a religious life the way we think of it today, where we think of religion as something sort of narrow and private, which it certainly isn't meant to be, but really the center of their whole life, the fabric of their life. This is how you live the good life. You live the good life by keeping this covenant, by keeping faithfulness with this law from God. And this is also why Jesus found himself, 1,500 years later or so, in conflict, more longer than that, but in conflict with people. There goes my son. With conflict with the people of Israel, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, other teachers of the law, as they debated him on his interpretation and understanding of the covenant. Of course, his is the one that we regard as authoritative because he's the one who gave it. He's the one who gave this covenant. And so even though Jesus is not here in his human person, he is the one who's speaking with the voice of God himself, because he himself is God, giving this law to Moses. So we're going to unpack these 10 Commandments, which are the very beginning of the covenant, and therefore have always occupied a place of primacy in the understanding, both Jewish and Christian, of the covenant and of life with God. And then it goes on to discuss other things here in chapter 20, which we will see. So when I look at it, I think, please don't bounce the table. Okay. Thank you. When I look at it, I think I'm just going to read the whole chapter as a chunk, and then we'll talk about it. So Exodus chapter 20, beginning at verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, Moses is, just picture this for a moment in your mind. Moses is leading the people of Israel. He's led them to be encamped around Mount Sinai. On Mount Sinai now, Moses is meeting with God, and when he does so, there's thunder, flashes of lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain is smoking, and the people are afraid. This becomes important later on in the New Testament, in a passage in the book of Hebrews, in which a contrast is made between this mountain and another mountain. And it's worth talking about that and reading that. So I'm going to turn for a moment to the book of Hebrews. And we're going to go here to chapter 10. Chapter 12. I always think 11 is the last chapter of Hebrews, and it's not. Chapter 12. Chapter 13 is the last chapter of Hebrews. And starting at verse 18. And here's what the writer of Hebrews has to say. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So there in Hebrews, we see a contrast set up between Mount Sinai with the tempest, what is described there as a tempest, the lightning, the peals of thunder, the darkness, the gloom, the voice that terrified people and said, You speak to us, Moses, but don't let God speak to us. And another mountain, Mount Zion, which is described as a festal gathering of angels and the firstborn from the dead, and the spirits made perfect by the blood of Christ, and God himself. And so there's like a mountain of gloom, a mountain of a festal gathering. What is given on the Mount of Gloom? The covenant given through Moses. What is given on Mount Zion, the Mount of the festal gathering? There is given salvation and all the favor of God. That tells us immediately from the outset how we understand this covenant that is being given to Moses. This is a covenant that was given for a couple reasons. Certainly in order to order the life of Israel, to set boundaries that would keep them safe and that would keep them in fellowship with God. But it was also given ultimately in order to prepare the world for salvation, for the coming of Christ. And the way that it prepares the world for the coming of Christ through God's servants, the people of Israel, is by speaking words that will expose and make clear what our sin is. And so St. Paul says in his letters, until the law came, we can go along and sort of think things are okay, but as soon as the law comes, as soon as the law came, we die. We have died because the law shows us our sin. Sin increases where the law is. Now, this is a very different view of the law from what we maybe think. We think when laws are given by God, this will decrease sin. And certainly to the extent that it constrains us and teaches us how to behave properly towards our neighbor and towards God, it does decrease sin in that outward practice of it. But in terms of the deeper spiritual reality, the law increases sin by showing us our fault, by exposing to us where we fall short of the glory of God. It's good to know that going into our study of the Ten Commandments and going into our study of the covenant that God gave through Moses, so that we understand its purpose from the beginning. And don't start thinking at the very start, well, now I have these laws, I can start doing them and I'll be fine. You know, all I need is the Ten Commandments, and if that pleases God, well, then I'll be saved. The Ten Commandments are given certainly so that our outward life is pleasing to God, but also so that our inward life is prepared for trusting in Jesus alone for our salvation and in his grace alone and not in our own good works. With that in mind, then, we also want to remember one more thing, that this is a law given a specific place and time to a specific people, the people of Israel, and that therefore there are parts of their life that condition the giving of these laws that make them, what I want to say, it's not that I'm not saying that they aren't valid today, but that there's language used that's specific to their life and helps us understand better what it's getting at. So for example, a really clear example of this to illustrate what I'm fumbling with here is verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Oh yeah, well, we all have houses, right? Or we have a home of some kind. So that speaks to us. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And we think, well, so that's specifically referring to men, because men are the ones who have wives, or his male servant or his female servant. We don't all have servants, or his ox or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So clearly this is speaking to a people who live at a time where wealth and possessions, and the major wealth and possessions, are defined by the possession of oxen and donkeys. It's speaking specifically to the men of the nation because of the reference to wives. And so today, we wouldn't say that. We would say, well, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's spouse, because we would think, well, let's include both men and women here. Servants aren't as common today, but certainly employees are more common. And instead of ox and donkeys, which certainly applies in an agrarian setting, we maybe would say your truck and your sedan or something like that, or your SUV, right? The major big things for us today are different from the major big things for them back then. So we just want to kind of keep that sort of point in mind so that we have a better appreciation of how these laws are valid for us today. These are laws that God speaks to the people of Israel, and they come down to us. So since we are not the people of Israel, but we are the new Israel, how do we hear them? Let's begin at the very beginning. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. This is significant that he begins this way. He begins by identifying who he is, by reminding them of what he's done for them. Right at the very beginning, I am the Lord your God, And here's what I did for you. I brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. So he establishes the covenant on the foundation of his works of salvation and redemption for the people of Israel. So we know from the start that this is a good word. This is a word from the one who wants the best for us. Wanted the best. Now, did he bring us out of the land of Egypt and out of the land of slavery? No. That's what I'm talking about. We have to remember the differences here. He didn't bring us out of the land of Egypt and us out of the land of slavery. But he did in the sense that he's brought us all out of slave servitude to sin. He's brought us out of the land of death by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That displays to us in an even greater way the love and favor of God, this universal gift and act on God's behalf for the salvation of the world, that he should do this for everybody through his son Jesus Christ, which is what we proclaim, that all may believe and trust in it and enjoy the benefits of that salvation. And so that's the foundation of the covenant. It's the foundation of our relationship with God, not what we have done, but what he has done on our behalf. And then he says, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, when you hear that statement, of course, we are taught to hear that as a command. It is a command. You shall not do this. It also has the language of promise. You shall have no other gods before me. Both command and promise. The command, don't follow other gods. The promise, I will be sure to protect you from other gods. I am going to make you a people who have no other gods, which is what he ultimately does for us in Jesus Christ by establishing in our hearts the kingdom and faith of Jesus alone. Another important part of this commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. It doesn't just say you shall have no other gods, but you shall have no other gods before me. Or in the Hebrew, the preposition used there in the Hebrew has a sense of in my presence. So there's not only a command here for our hearts and our minds, where our minds and our hearts are in terms of faith, but also there's a command here for worship. You shall not bring other gods who are not I, the Lord your God, when I am present with you in worship, when I am present with you to speak with you, when I am present with you to bless you, you shall not bring other gods into my presence, and sort of have an amalgam or a mixture of faiths and religions, what we call syncretism, a mixing of gods. You shall not have that in your midst. You shall not have that in my midst, says the Lord. And this is going to become more important as we see what happens with the golden calf a little bit later in Exodus. So there's a command here not only in terms of our hearts, but also in terms of our behavior and how we conduct worship, how we conduct church life. We're not to have fellowship with those who hold to a false god. And so, there's lots of nice, good people, and you're probably friends with them, and I'm friends with them, who are not in the church, are not Christian, but that doesn't, and there may be some other religion, that doesn't mean that because they're nice and because we're friends, we bring that all together into one faith, one religion, one worship service. The Lord commands very clearly holiness. He commands very clearly that he be revered alone as God. And so then he goes on to say, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. And so I have to check the time here. Pastor Johnson, what's the time?
8:50.
All right, because my son, who you've seen walking around, I got to get him home at a certain time. But anyway, so then he goes on to describe this again more in terms of worship and of religious practice. So since I am the Lord your God, you're to have no other gods before me. Therefore, do not bring in idols of other gods into my midst. Do not bring in idols of other creatures into my midst. Don't bow down and serve them. Bow down and serve me alone. Now, different churches at this point will number the commandments differently. And some will take what I just said, you shall have no other gods before me, as the first commandment, and then the next one as the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image of any likeness of anything. The reason why we do not in the Lutheran Church, and why the church, generally speaking, has not done that for 2,000 years, is because we discerned from the beginning that this was a command specifically geared towards Israel in their context, where they were surrounded by people who expressed their worship of false gods through graven images, and who therefore presented a threat to worshiping God alone. However, we've also noticed that God does later permit the creation of engraved images, such as the two cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant, two very clear statues of angels, also the engraving of pomegranates and other creatures on the temple frieze, or the temple decor around the temple exterior, or was it the interior? We'll find out later in Exodus. And so God does permit that graven artistry to be used in some contexts, but not in the context of introducing a false god into his worship. So that answers why we do have statues of Jesus, why we do have statues of angels. God permitted Israel to have them. And so when we take those words together, when we take the whole view of Scripture, not just one little part of it, when we look at the whole view of Scripture, we see that this is something that he does permit generally, but he does not permit in the context of introducing false gods into his worship. So it's not a command that continues to, as a command, it's part of the first command, that you shall have no other gods before me. And so it's not a commandment that stands on its own for us, but is part of that first one against idolatry. And then we come to the third command, what we call the second commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Very clear. It means that we are to use the name of the Lord for good purposes, prayer, praise, and thanksgiving, and not for negative ones, for cursing, for lying, for defrauding. It's amazing how often people use the name of God for the purpose of defrauding other people or advancing their own agenda. It's not there for that purpose. It's there for us to call upon God in prayer, praise, and thanksgiving to express our trust in him. And then we come to another commandment over which there has been much debate in sort of the recent centuries of Christianity. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the seventh day is, of course, Saturday, and the first day is Sunday. And so people are like, how can Christians worship on Sunday and not on Saturday, since God says right here to remember the Sabbath day and to not do any work on it? Well, again, we see in Holy Scripture, when we take the whole Scriptures together, that Christians worshipped on Sunday morning. Did they also worship on the Sabbath? They did for a time. But as Jesus teaches in the Gospels, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not made to be a burden laid upon man, but man is there to be served by the Sabbath, that is, by the day of rest. And as the apostles declare in their writings in the epistles, we've entered into the greater rest, the rest of God's favor, which makes every day a Sabbath, and therefore frees us to worship in a fashion that proclaims this greater favor of God, namely worshiping on the day in which Christ rose from the dead, which is Sunday. And so that is why in our explanation in the Catechism of the Lutheran Church to the Third Commandment, remember the Sabbath day, We don't focus on you being righteous, making yourself righteous by resting the best you can, which was the debate between the Pharisees and Jesus. Remember, Jesus allowed his disciples to do things the Pharisees saw as work. But rather, we are resting by faith, and our focus is on what creates that faith, the preaching of the word. What is the Sabbath day? It's the preaching of the word. It's listening to that word and trusting it. I need to pause now. I need to stop. And we'll pick this up next week so I can get my son off to where he needs to go. The Lord's peace be with you and grant you his blessing this day. Peace be with you.